It is Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023, and welcome to episode 243 of Fault Lines, NSI's podcast that typically gets you quickly up to speed on national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Today, though, we have another special treat for you, the fourth episode in our summer series, Breaking Barriers, Understanding the AI Revolution. For those of you who don't remember, because admittedly I've been off the airwaves lately, I'm Jessica Jones, NSI's Deputy Executive Director, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Ann Neuberger, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technology. Prior to serving on the National Security Council, Ms. Neuberger served as the Director of Cybersecurity for the NSA, where she led NSA's cybersecurity mission, as well as leading the agency's election security effort and serving as Assistant Deputy Director of NSA's Operations Directorate. So before I ask you questions about what the Biden administration is doing in terms of AI policy and where you see advancements in AI, I kind of wanted to do some level setting for those of us who are not experts in the space. And, you know, we hear a lot about AI in the news. You can't go one day without it being in the headlines somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to get your take on some kind of big questions. A lot of the talk about AI focuses on the dangers. But, you know, how do you see AI transforming the national security landscape? You know, what are some of the promising and beneficial uses of AI, and what do you see as the biggest real threats arising from AI's advancements?
It's so good to be here with you, Jessica. Thank you so much. And those are big questions there. So let's unpack that a bit. So I love the way you started with promising and beneficial, because AI is just a really good example of a technology that's dual use. As the president has said, we want to absolutely reap the benefits for our society, for our economies, but we also really need to carefully manage the attendant risks. So how do we approach that? So let's start to your point. And you asked a two-part question. You said, where do we see it from a national security perspective? So I'll give two big picture, and then I want to get to more exemplar. So from a big picture perspective, two areas I think about often on the national security side. I come out of the intelligence community, where one of the biggest challenges we grapple with is how to make sense out of the masses of data. There's more and more data. And particularly when we're thinking about a time-sensitive threat, the ability to make sense rapidly of the most important intelligence in time to warn and address it. So certainly AI's ability to learn off patterns, to identify potentially to help us make sense of that quickly is promising. The second part of that is, in the intelligence community, if you want to know, tell me, as an intelligent consumer, if you're sitting at your desk and saying, I really need to know something about this particular Russian intelligence unit, this particular Chinese cyber unit, you can write a query and you get back many, many reports. And you have to read those reports to kind of summarize the intelligence community's knowledge of a given topic. The ability to potentially use a ChatGPT-like capability to say, summarize the most relevant points along this, 20 years of intelligence reporting on a given topic can potentially just democratize access to intelligence and frankly enable our human analysts to focus on new reporting, new insights in just a really more impactful way. So that's one area specific to national security. When we think about the cyber arena, what keeps me up at night are the vastness of the attack surface. You think about critical infrastructure in the United States, connected critical infrastructure, right? Hugely compelling from a promising and beneficial perspective in terms of how do we do energy grid optimization better? How do we ensure that, I visited Chicago recently and saw the use of AI to improve the speed and the efficiency of restaurant health inspections. Where should they go? Where should they find, right? Huge benefits there. On the other hand, there are some particular key risks we worry about. But on the benefit side, you can see we're improving key services and critical infrastructure. You can see we're helping us write more secure code by training systems on well-written code versus the full body of code that includes human errors, and then using that to kind of test code before we release it. That's an area of promise. On the risk side, sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, no. I'm so fascinated. I think your answers are more important than my questions.
Not at all, but you did ask a question that I'm answering, so I'll get to that and then we'll. Yeah. So on the risk side, we really need, and that was the reason the president convened the group of companies back in May and then reconvened them to get their voluntary commitments. we need to ensure that AI models that we're developing and integrating are safe, trustworthy, and secure. And what do we mean by that? By safe, we've seen that some models can create harmful content or produce hallucinations, saying things that very confidently that are inaccurate or fictitious. So that's one key risk, particularly if you have people using ChatGPT like to ask medical questions. Very concerning. By trustworthy, we're concerned to make sure that AI is behaving as expected. So think about a model, for example, that might be trained on, radiological imaging or ultrasound imaging to accelerate the identification of potential illness. If that model behaves in ways that's not expected, that's really troubling. You see huge benefit potentially in terms of accelerating, in terms of machines finding things that perhaps a human eye could miss. But we want to ensure that we understand the conclusions models come to, and we understand where the use of a model really needs a human in the loop to ensure that before some decisions are made, they're right. And then the final thing, by secure, we're very concerned that models not be hacked or made less useful, less trustworthy. So for example, I recently visited Cincinnati, where they have a combined sewage overflow system. It's an old 100-year-old system, and there have been, federal consent decrees that have required upgrades to that system. There are the potential for AI algorithms to better manage water in existing pipes, which could then, make it a lot less cheaper to upgrade those systems. But you can also see where a model like that, that's managing which water goes where, if maliciously attacked, could cause harm to a population, cause illness, etc. So that last piece about ensuring models are secure, that they're trustworthy, and that they're safe, that's an example of what we must ensure to make sure that as we start using AI, it's trustworthy and that we're protected from adversarial use of AI.
No, that's great. And before I can dive into some of your examples about safety, security, and trust. So as you mentioned, the pledge by a bunch of tech companies last week made headlines. And so, for those on the outside, it's hard to even imagine how much conversation and workshopping goes into, getting a very large stakeholders on board with these kind of crucial fundamental pledges. What do you think, the Biden administration has also talked about an EO on AI, and you see a lot of statements on Capitol Hill from congressional lawmakers. It's such a challenging area, rapidly developing technology with many stakeholders, a very quick uptake by the public. Your mention of ChatGPT, people are beginning to realize how much AI comes into their everyday life. What do you think are some of the challenges on, for the government to stay ahead, to think about policies and regulations that both embrace innovation and also, though, to your point, address these concerns about privacy, malicious use, and the like?
You hit two key issues that are really the biggest challenge for policymakers. One is the speed at which the technology is advancing, and two, the fact that we can't just sit and wait. We need to write policy that can address this technology, but also that addresses future unforeseen developments of that. And that's really the tricky part of the policy. And I think the three pieces you talked about are our attempt to do so. So first, the president convening the companies to say, you need to make voluntary commitments to really ensure that before models are released, you've red teamed them, you have good cybersecurity practices to protect them, you've ensured that you're bringing in experts in different domains. The second piece of that then is the government using and doing everything in its power to protect against the risks of AI, which is the executive order that's under development. That is a final bridge to new regulation, which only the Hill can do. And as you know, Speaker Schumer has kicked off that piece. So you see all three components: private sector, ensuring fully leveraging what government can do now, and then coming up with new regulation to address the new technology and the attendant new risks it brings.
So speaking of Senator Schumer, he had mentioned that, and this is, not a new concept, that policymakers sometimes not out of touch, but maybe not the most informed on, rapidly advancing technologies, their use, applications. And so he, wanted tutorials or workshops to make sure that members of Congress, know what the technologies they're talking about. How big of it is a challenge for something like AI, whether it's public understanding, so they can understand the laws and policies they're coming into play with, or for policymakers, like how much do you think of a learning curve? How much do we need to catch up?
It's a great question. And I think Senator Schumer has talked about why he's using a different approach here to address that issue, a concern that when you have traditional hearings, less an opportunity to learn and interact versus I think what he's been thinking of, which is bringing in experts in smaller groups to educate. And that's really key here. But that being said, we also know the technology will continue to evolve. So there's no one and done.
Mm-hmm.
We have to continuously monitor and watch and learn to ensure that while we need to move out quickly, we then need to ensure that what we put in place is correct, reassess, and kind of circulate through that over time.
And then since we're kind of on the policymaker bent, obviously, it seems that AI implicates much more than just, within the borders of the US, it's global. And it seems that international cooperation, discussion is crucial for AI, whether it's, the US government working with partners and allies, whether it's AI research or AI policies, how does the government view working with partners abroad, whether it comes to research or whether it comes to maybe even international norm setting?
It's a really great question. So, President Biden is all about alliances and partnerships, and the administration is actively working to pursue international coalitions, both for the good AI governance and learning, as well as the regulatory side. Back in January, we worked closely with the European Union on an administrative agreement to partner on AI for good in 5 specific areas for government, areas like emergency management. How do we ensure that we can rapidly respond to emergencies? Extreme weather and the attendant impact on food. Are there, for example, can we predict weather and use that to help understand how to adjust irrigation policies, growing policies, et cetera? So that work kicked off. And, interestingly, Jessica, so the German ambassador who just retired invited me to give a talk. She assembled a group of female ambassadors to give a talk, and she asked me to give a talk on AI, to the group. And then a couple of the ambassadors there, one from Latin America, one from Africa, said, "Don't leave us behind. AI will offer such promise in education to help customize education for kids. Please help ensure our communities are not left behind." And I think that's a big part of what our approach is as well, is to make sure that not only the developed nations benefit, but that we can be instrumental in elevating the voices of the developing world as well to ensure they benefit. And then similarly, as you know, we're also working, of course, on the regulatory approach, working closely with the EU on their regulatory approach, working to take our voluntary commitments to brief other countries after they went, right before they went public, to help kind of create that threshold of what should be required of companies in this space, how we all need to think about risk in this space. So really, it's both aspects of that. Let's harness the good and let's manage the risks as part of a global coalition.
Speaking of that, because I'm just an optimist. So AI for good, just a little bit, what you gave a bunch of great examples from those conversations. Is there any in particular that stand out that you think this is the most interesting, here's a great example of AI for good that people aren't talking about that really could, impact the world? I'm just wondering, what, when you say keeps you up at night in the bad way, what keeps you up at night in the good way?
Multiple different areas. I'll give one of them, for example, is drug discovery. The process of drug discovery, simulation of proteins, testing is lengthy, costly, and difficult. So the potential for AI to both identify potential, substances that offer a lot of promise and then help simulate some of that early testing is huge. I think we have currently a number of drugs that are in first stage clinical trials that were AI developed. And then I think about it, in a very human way. I grew up with a cousin who was blind, and we used to go for walks together. And, it taught me to see the sidewalk and crossing a street in a different way. And all she had was a stick. And you have to wonder if that stick is connected to the internet and can see a speeding car coming, can identify the fastest way for a blind person to get to where they need to go. Because look, navigating the streets, busy streets in a city is difficult. Think about what that can do. And I think finally in that way, when the president met with a group of AI researchers in San Francisco, and there was a lot of focus on risk and concerns and all the pieces of AI that we need to carefully think about. And then one researcher said, my father, lost his vision at the end of his life. And he kept telling me, "You're a leading AI researcher. There's so many people growing old. How could this help us as our capabilities degrade to navigate and maintain our independence?" So I think, and you see the areas of computer vision, right? which are a key area of advancements. How could that help people who are losing vision to still retain, to help retain more precision in what they see? So I think those are some of the areas that are really most heartening.
And then, a lot of these examples are, developments are coming a lot from the private sector and industry, technology. It seems as if the innovation ecosystem is being taken over by the private sector in a lot of ways. One, I don't know if you agree with that or not, but if even somewhat true, in particular when it comes to AI, how can the government and private sector, best collaborate? How can the government support industry in advancing AI and vice versa? How does industry work with government?
It's a great question. So first you see, there's efforts that the National Science Foundation has in the national AI research related area, where there's compute that's available to researchers to use to do work that they need to do. And in fact, NSF is funding AI institutes in a number of communities around the country focused on a particular application area of AI. And it goes back to the way we've looked at research in various technology areas, back to the 1950s, which helped make advancements in those areas and really democratize access. So different kinds of researchers could see that. And I think in addition to that, as we think about the way AI could, for example, improve critical government services, that's another area for partnership. Because let's say we think about, a connected grid, and where we best need charging stations based on weather, based on traffic, based on commuting patterns. Certainly, AI models can help ensure that government investment is done in the most efficient way and then stays up to date to serve its citizens. How we both, the innovation, the pride of America is really the fact that we're leading in the space and American innovators are leading. And where government partners is to say, let's bring regulators who are accustomed to thinking about safety and risk and say, what are the ways that we just refine that innovation so that we're not caught by surprise when the model does something unexpected? So I think bringing together domain experts, government and private sector, to, as we're looking at how to regulate in the space to ensure that it's light touch, to manage the risks, and also, frankly, where there are policies that are preventing use of AI that could help us advance economically, that could help drive down bias, whether it's loan decisions, whether it's in education applications, that those are done in a way that kind of are true to who we are as a country and our values.
And if you were going to give a report card on this process of, light touch, using domain experts to help, point out areas, where do you think we stand now? Is the government doing a good job when it comes to working with the private sector on AI? Can it do better? Well, everyone can always do better, but are there certain areas for improvement?
I think that's what we're working through right now, right? So you saw the initial work where the president brought together the leading CEOs and had a conversation to say, you are partners in accountability. You need Americans to trust that, for example, when they get an answer out of AI or an image is generated, they know whether it's AI generated or they know whether it's a real image, right? If there is a voice, a piece of a voice cut of something, they need to know, is that AI generated because the voice models are so precise and so good, or is that real? Because we see the dangers that, for example, very good voice models are bringing in the fraud arena, particularly vulnerable elderly populations. So I think the president bringing them in and saying, we need you to act, and then companies coming back with their first set of commitments in those areas related to figuring out how to mark content, whether it's AI generated or not AI generated. That's an area where technically it's hard, right? There's some initial work, but more is needed. And I think that's where we come back and say, look, we'll do targeted cooperation on the research together, but you guys need to act, even in parallel, as we then work, for example, an executive order that will put in place, using the extent of our current authorities, how we need to look at managing for the potential bias based on what data models are trained on, how we need to ensure, for example, that before AI models are integrated with something physical so they can kick off a robot, they can kick off an action, that there's certain principles in place. That's the work, that's the current partnership. So where I'd put us, to your question, is I think we're both showing the power of public-private partnership in the way the president has convened, but also showing that our lessons learned from social media, our lessons learned from cyber, is that we're connected societies, risks come with that, and we have to be thoughtful and build it securely from the outset. And I think that's what we're trying to do with both the EO, the Hills work to rapidly learn and build regulation.
And then you touched upon it, and it's, I think, one of the more tangible uses of AI with deep fakes. And you talk about labeling, how serious is the threat? I mean, we see photos, videos, and it makes headlines when things are debunked or shown not to be authentic. I mean, how can we both, while AI is generating a lot of that kind of deep fakes misinformation, how can AI actually be used to kind of counter this disinformation and help enhance, accountability and authenticity?
It's a great question. We're really troubled by the generation of very precise looking deep fakes. I think you see what's going on in the realm of child pornography and in the realm of splicing real women's faces on to create pornographic images. That's a way to really subject vulnerable populations in a horrible way, right? So I think to that way there's a race between offense and defense, much as there is in the race on malware or finding vulnerabilities for good. And I think the key is really two things. One, we need to both start watermarking content, so it shows who generated it, was it AI generated, particularly for voice, video, and images. And then really work to ensure that in that race between offense and defense, you'll put a watermark on, folks will figure out how to remove it, figure out a more sophisticated way, it's going to go back and forth, that the ability to maintain it always stays one step ahead, because anonymity is not a good thing. And there needs to be accountability for it, as well as, frankly, the positive aspect of artists and singers and songwriters who want to maintain the copyrights to the content they work so hard to generate. So I think that's a key piece there.
So it's, the example of trying to offense versus defense and staying on when, you get someone go, sides up your roadblock. It leads me to wonder, at least we talk a lot about the cyber workforce and increasing the pipeline. Seems like we're going to have a demand for AI related workforce. And, how do we start to build a kind of a skilled workforce with those skill sets and that creativity to meet kind of all of these challenges you've laid out?
It's a great question. And I do want to note that there will be kind of a cool DARPA announcement coming on that kind of offense and defense race on the cyber side, because it's something that we want to bring in a community, getting to your point about people, to work this. Much as in the cyber arena, jumpstarting programs like finding vulnerabilities, was a way to get lots of people interested in bug bounty programs, really democratized and brought many more people into working this. I think that's what we're trying to do on the AI side with that upcoming announcement. Back to people, it's one of the key areas that the president's asked us to look at in the executive order, a recognition that both to ensure we're doing thoughtful, informed policy, we need folks in government to guide that. And because we really do believe that government services can be made more accessible, more efficient and effective. So ensuring that we lead in that way. So there are, we've been thinking about various ways to both attract talent to government and AI, to both create more talent. So there's a difference between being a leading AI researcher and knowing how to use existing models to train, for example, to answer detailed questions about the tax code. And I think that second category is where we're excited and hoping to bring in more individuals to help ensure that all the data we collect in government, we can train models on those to help both learn and make government services more efficient and also make them more accessible.
Great. And so I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but what kind of national security podcast would we be if we didn't at least ask a little bit about China? So, China has, of course, when we think about tech competition and your peer competitor, think of China and their investments in AI development. And they have their own next generation AI development plan, which is to capture the global lead in AI development by 2030. what does the government make of China's AI means and capabilities? I mean, should the US be worried and if, we are leading in AI, how do we continue to lead?
I love the question, and I love that their goal is capturing the lead by 2030, e.g. vigorously try to keep up with the United States, which is terrific. And that's, again, a tribute to the innovation that America's democratic approach that attracts individuals from around the world and it really creates. We've led the world in AI research and development, so much so that China now has to redouble its effort to compete with us. So we've watched China's approach to both the development and regulation with a great deal of interest, right? Because we're not just two countries competing, we're two different models of government and how government interacts with its citizens competing. And I'd highlight their recent policy directive, which is interesting because it explicitly restricts domestic usage of AI. It says it must be in conformance with socialist principles, while being particularly permissive with AI R&D in their research centers and in commercial use of AI, for overseas commercial purposes. So they've put in place guardrails for domestic audiences, but not for export or usage around the world. So, and we really think that in the long run, our approach, which is safe by design AI, whether it's domestic or international, you need the trust, you need the safety, you need to ensure that it's an approach that supports responsible innovation is the better approach. And, just another thought on this, there was an interesting piece in Foreign Affairs recently entitled, I think it was called The Illusion of China's AI Prowess. And it was interesting because we often, talk about their power. And it said, while even if they're innovative, it'll be difficult to integrate AI into their society because it's such a controlled society. For example, the guardrails on ensuring that speech, toes to the CCP line is particularly limiting. So I think we're pretty confident that innovation, diffusion, careful, responsible regulation, that really brings private and public sector together to use the technology will win out in the end. But that doesn't mean we're not watching carefully and thinking carefully about that balance between AI for good. I think it's captured in the term responsible innovation, AI for good and regulation.
Well, there's no better way to end with, we don't have to be as worried as we think we have to. So with that, that's a wrap. Thank you so much to Ms. Neuberger for joining us on Fault Lines for our fourth installment of Breaking Barriers, Understanding the AI Revolution. And thanks to Brooke Agacon, Angelina Mongini, and Devlin Burney from NSI, and Claude Jennings for their help in producing today's episode. Please, if you like what you heard, don't forget to rate and review and join us next week for another episode on AI.